Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started here in about a minute. You all got very quiet. All right, it's 1 o'clock, or no, it's 12 o'clock. Right, we'll get started now. Thank you for coming out. What we're presenting on today, a smarter way to test accessibility, a comparison of top tools, Lighthouse, Tenon, and the Wave API. My name's Everett Zufelt. I'm the Director of Technology at MyPlanet. I started speaking at DrupalCon in 2010 at DrupalCon San Francisco, where I did a core talk on accessibility. I was the Drupal 7 accessibility maintainer. I participated in the HTML working group at the W3C, mostly looking at issues of accessibility in HTML5. And now I work at MyPlanet and I support a growing team of technologists using tools like Drupal and React and others to build cool applications for our customers.
My name is Laura Johnson. I'm a developer at MyPlanet. I've been a Drupal developer for over 10 years. And I'm also involved with the Drupal community. I help facilitate the Drupal user group in Toronto. And for the past few months, I have been researching accessibility tools and testing them.
So what are we going to cover today? Just kind of list of topics, make sure you're in the right spot. First thing we're going to talk about, we won't do an intro to accessibility really. We'll assume everybody here has a rough understanding of what web accessibility is. Maybe I'll just touch on it for a minute. We'll talk about the difference between automated and manual accessibility testing and what that really means. We're going to give a really high-level overview of the three tools we're looking at today, Lighthouse, Tenon, and Wave. We're going to talk about the browser extensions each of those tools makes available and how they can make your life as a tester easier or as a developer easier. We're going to talk about the command line interface available through each tool and how those can speed things up for you. It's the DevOps track, so we're going to talk about continuous integration, obviously, and how we can take some of those command line interfaces and integrate them with the build and deployment pipeline to make testing more robust and more reliable. And then at the end, we'll spend a few minutes talking about what the future could hold and how we might be able to apply some concepts around machine learning to expanding upon what these tools are able to do. So in a nutshell, web accessibility testing, there's a few different standards out there. The one we talk about the most is WCAG, which is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That being said, ATAG or ATAG, the authoring tool accessibility guidelines, are also very important. WCAG is a set of guidelines from the W3C, which are primarily designed to make content on the web, I'd expand that to say web applications, more accessible to persons with the following types of disabilities: blindness and low vision, deafness and hearing loss, learning disabilities, cognitive limitations, limited movement, speech disabilities, photosensitivity, and combinations. So primarily, the WCAG, the guidelines are there to make your jobs easier designing and developing and testing web applications and web content that will be useful by persons with a broad range of disabilities. And I'm sure if you've sat in sessions before, intro or intermediate sessions about web accessibility, you've heard over and over and over again, automated tools cannot fully test accessibility. It just can't happen. And that's true. We're not here to tell you anything other than that. It's interesting, Carl Groves, who's the founder of the Tenon IO tool that we're going to be talking about today, tweeted earlier today, and he said, in response to the question, can the Tenon tool certify my WCAG compliance? Sounds like a question he'd get a lot. The answer is no. Accessibility tools are diagnostic tools, not judges. Now, Carl's got a vested interest in convincing the world that automated accessibility testing tools can certify your compliance. And indeed, if they could, and if his could, he'd be a rich man. But they can't, and we'll talk a little bit more here about where some of the gaps are. So I did a few contrasts here up on the slide. We'll talk through each one to just help dig into a little bit where the gap is in some of these tools, and this is clearly not an exhaustive list. A tool can tell you very easily if an image in your HTML or in your DOM has an alt attribute. That's easy. That, most developers in the room would be able to write a couple lines of code in their preferred language and answer that question. What it can't do is tell you if the alt text is accurate given the context of the usage of that image. So I can tell you if there's text in the field. I can't tell you if the text lines up with the image. What a testing tool can do very easily is tell you whether or not your form field has a label, note. We'll show you in a little bit with some of the browser extensions that there's a form field on the DrupalCon Nashville website that doesn't have a label. What it can't do is tell you if the label or the description for that form field is clear and easy to understand. The tool can easily tell you whether or not there's headings in your document, and we can have debates about whether or not there should be more 0, 1, or 2 first-level headings on a page for years and years. It can't tell you, the tools can't tell you today whether or not those headings are in the proper hierarchy to support the meaning of the content that you've written. A tool can really easily tell you if your HTML is valid. There's lots of validator tools out there to look at your document and tell you if the HTML is valid HTML. What it can't do is tell you if the HTML is semantic. It can't tell you if you've used the right elements to represent the right sections of your document. And then this last note I've put here says custom implementation, so that really a tool can't do anything for you at all here today. Does the application user interface behave as expected? And we'll show you in a little bit here when we take a look at the DrupalCon website, and we look at the drop-down menu. None of the tools that we're looking at today actually identify the accessibility barrier with the drop-down menu. And that's because it's not strictly speaking something that the tools can test for. The tools don't know how the menu ought to behave, so there can't be a rule set that evaluates whether or not the menu behaves in the right way. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we do the testing. Really what this breaks down into, if you think this through, if you look it through, tools can test to make sure that something exists or that it doesn't exist for the presence or the absence of data. Tools can test to ensure that things are present in the document. What they can't do is assess the meaning of the content and evaluate the semantics that you've applied to it. The tools don't know how to do that today. So really there's 2 types of automated tool out there, and I made this up so somebody can argue with me and tell me there's a third. That's fine. There's really 2 types of automated accessibility testing tool in the market today. There's tools that are primarily geared around making the job of developers easier. And I'd extend that to say developers and testers. So there's tools that are designed for that purpose, and there's other tools that are designed for conformance and reporting. So if you're a developer or a QA specialist and your role is to build and test accessible applications, there's tools that are built to make your job easier. And if you work in a reporting function, a conformance or a regulatory compliance function within an organization or within a department of a government, there's tools out there that are built to make your job easier. because it's DrupalCon and we're on the DevOps track and we're talking to what I would imagine is primarily developers and testers, we've chosen today to focus on that former set of tools, the tools that were designed and purpose-built to make your lives easier, notwithstanding the fact that there's another set of tools out there in the world engineered around conformance and compliance. And when Laura talks through some of the tools in a few minutes here, you'll see that at least one of these tools straddles the fence. It maybe was more originally geared toward making the life of engineering easier, but certainly has some reporting and conformance capabilities built in as well. So we're looking at 3 tools today, and we picked these tools, I'd say primarily because they're the 3 most common tools that fall into this making the developer's life easier bucket, and you can't really test all of the tools in the market and present them all. One tool we're testing is Lighthouse. It's a tool from Google. Lighthouse tests much more than accessibility. It tests other things like performance. It's able to test whether or not your application conforms with the requirements to be a progressive web app. It's able to test quite a few things. One of the advantages of Lighthouse is it's open source and it's free. We're at an open source conference. That's important to many of us. And it's built on top of the accessibility testing portion of Lighthouse is built on top of an open source accessibility testing rule set called Axe. So I think that's the one open source tool that we're looking at today. And again, from Google, and they didn't build this rule set themselves. They themselves are leveraging knowledge within the broader accessibility community. Second tool that we'll be looking at today is Tenon.io. I already mentioned Carl Groves and a quote from him earlier. It's a newer entrant in the commercial market, founded by Carl. It's not open source. It's not free. There's a pay-per-use with Tenon. It has API support. I'm on the newsletter. There seems to be a fairly constantly expanding tool set and coverage of what's able to be tested. And Tenon has built into it the ability to crawl applications. So you're not stuck to just being able to test one page at a time. It's got a crawler built in. The last tool we'll be talking about today is Wave, or the Wave API. This is from the WebAIM community at, I believe, the University of Utah, and many people, if not most people who have ever done any accessibility testing have used the Wave browser extension. The Wave API really is just an extension of that and allows you to submit requests and automate some of that testing rather than having to test one page at a time in the browser. Again, it's a commercial tool. It's not free to be able to use this tool, but it's been supported by the WebAIM community for quite some time. So now what we'll do, really what we want to walk you through is showing you how the browser extensions for each of these tools can make testing easier. After that, we're going to talk more about how the command line interface can speed up that testing job. Obviously, you don't want to be testing many pages across many browsers manually each time you want to go perform testing. And then we'll dig into how we can integrate some of those command line tools into a continuous integration process.
Yes, so the browser extensions, there is a browser extension for each of the tools that we tested. And the great thing about them is that they're all free for each one, even though normally Wave API is pay-per-use, and so is Tenon.io. All 3 browser extensions are free. And they are not, they are automated accessibility tools, even though you actually have to go and test each page one at a time. They can help you reveal issues with invisible elements. They can help you catch issues you didn't know were issues. On the downside, you have to remember to use them. And it is a little more time-consuming than using a command line interface tool, which we'll get to in a little while. and you can only test a single URL at a time. So with that, it is live demo time, and I am going to show you, let me just get out of here. Oops. Let's take a look at the DrupalCon Nashville site. We chose this site because we all probably have a little bit of familiarity with it already. And also, it's a good representative site in that it has a lot of different features here on the home page. And so the first browser extension, you can see the browser extensions up in the top right corner here. We've got Wave and Tenon.io. I'm going to show you Wave to start off with, which I think is a fabulous browser extension. It's I consider it the Cadillac of browser extensions. Even though it is, these icons sort of make it a very colorful, maybe 90s model Cadillac. So you can see that there's a summary panel that opens up on the left, and it shows you right away there are errors. There are 6 errors on this page. But the great thing about this browser extension is that it actually annotates the page for you. So you can scroll down, and you can actually see where, at a glance, where the errors are located. So right here, we can see, what is this? We've got an H2 tag here with an error beside it. If you click on it, it says there's a heading here that contains no content. And if you click on more information, it tells you, it opens up this little information tab in the sidebar. It tells you, why does that matter? Some users, especially keyboard and screen reader users, often navigate by heading elements. An empty heading will present no information and may introduce confusion. And another feature of this extension is this little code tab at the bottom here, which, if you open it up, will show you the annotated HTML, so you can actually see the code in question. And we can see that there's just an empty H2 tag there, which was probably added by a content editor at some point and just didn't get caught. They removed the text, but they didn't remove the tag. So that is a very easy fix. If we keep scrolling down, we can see, here are 2 form fields, and we can see that they do not have labels. Now, why is this an issue? If a form control does not have a properly associated text label, that form control may not be presented to screen users, and form labels also provide visible descriptions and larger clickable targets for form controls. So essentially, someone with a screen reader might not know how to use this field if there's no label here. And if we look at the annotated code, it looks as though this is actually a MailChimp form. So this has probably just been cut and pasted here. But again, this is a really easy fix. Probably the developer just didn't realize it was there. So if we keep scrolling down, we see, okay, there are no more visible errors, but we do know that there are 6 errors. So probably the other errors are hidden behind theme elements. But the Wave browser has this handy No Styles tab, which allows you to look at the page without styles, so that you can actually see all of the hidden elements there. This MailChimp field has a 3rd input element, which looks as though it says real people should not fill this in and expect good things. Do not remove this or risk form bot signups. So clearly this is some sort of a honeypot type field that prevents bots from using the form. if we scroll back up to the top, we can see that what was hidden in the header was that the skip to main content. Now, the skip to main content link is added for keyboard users, meaning users that don't use a mouse. This link helps them skip over the navigation because otherwise they have to tab, 150 times or however long it takes to get through the navigation to get to the main content. Well, in this case, if we look at the error, the skip navigation link exists, but the target for the link does not exist, or the link is not keyboard accessible. And what has actually happened is you can see that it should be linking to a div of ID content, but there is no content div on here. So probably what happened is the developer altered the template for the page and just didn't realize that there was a link in the header that was going to be broken afterwards. The skip to search link is also similarly does not have a div that it skips to. So those are issues that, if a developer used a tool like Wave, it's just really easy to identify them. In the case of the form with the missing labels, it is if it is a designer that is asked for the placeholder fields, because it looks nice to have placeholder text instead of title text, but if the developer knows, well, it's an accessibility issue, then they can go back to the designer and say, is there a workaround for this that will work for accessibility? Okay, so I'm just going to briefly show the other browser extensions. Tenon.io. If we click on Tenon.io, this one actually, apparently I've used up all of my my test now abilities, so I can't show that to you. But it looks rather like these screenshots here that you see. It's got a little report at the top, but again, these are, if you were paying for the API credits, you would be able to use that and have all of the other features as well. Tenon actually has quite a nice reporting dashboard where you can see sort of your testing history and all of that sort of thing, but you need to pay for it. So now I will show you Lighthouse. So unlike Tenon and Wave, where you have to install the extensions, if you're using Chrome, then Lighthouse is baked in to the developer tools. So if you want to use it, you can just open up the developer tools. And I've got the audits tab open here. So normally if it was at the bottom, you would see all of these tabs, but you'd open up the audits tab and click on perform an audit. Now you have all of these different options to choose from, and they're all helpful, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to choose the accessibility one and run the audit. So it goes ahead and it tests mobile, and it tests for desktop, and it is going to show me a report here in the sidebar in the audits tab again. So you can see that it doesn't annotate anything on the page the way that Wave does, but it does show you the errors. So here, elements have discernible names is a category, and it's going to show you that, okay, there's some buttons that do not have an accessible name, and it shows you the failing elements, and so a snippet here. We'll show you the offending element. It shows you Lighthouse is showing us a couple of things that Wave did not show. Iframe elements do not have a title, And I looked, and that's actually the ads. And here is the form elements do not have associated labels. And it's also showing us that there are color contrast errors, which Wave does as well. There is a tab in Wave that shows you the color contrast errors. And it shows you that there were also 16 past audits, yay! And 15 not applicable audits, okay. And additional items to manually check. Now, as Everett mentioned earlier, none of the browser extensions caught that there is an accessibility issue with the menu. And I don't know if you want to speak to why they don't.
Yes, certainly. So one of the issues with the menu, and if you sat in the session yesterday where we were talking about JavaScript and accessibility, we did a bit of demo, and maybe Laura can do a bit of a demo here as well, where for a keyboard-only user or a screen reader user even, the drop-down menu on the DrupalCon Nashville website really creates a barrier. And the reason for that barrier is it's not really possible for a keyboard-only user to get to the sub-menu items. So as you tab across the top-level menu items, you certainly can see that the sub-menus expand, but there's no keyboard control or keyboard mechanism that allows you to navigate down through those sub-menu items. What's of interest is that none of these 3 browser extensions and none of these 3 accessibility testing tools flag that for us in the report. In the audit, they're not able to catch this. The reason is because this is essentially a complex user interface component. It's something that doesn't exist in the HTML specification, and it's something that the tools themselves don't know to look for. The tools don't know how to, at this time, they don't know how to look at your page and say, that looks like a menu. I bet you something's supposed to drop down from there. I bet you that once it drops down, the user needs to be able to navigate through the list. The tools just aren't able to make the types of inferences about the user interface that humans are based on the visual affordances that you see when you look at the page. And so that, amongst some of the things we were talking about earlier, are one of the limitations of automated testing. You know, not only can't we tell you whether or not the alt text of my cute cat is applied incorrectly to your cute dog, automated testing also can't infer what type of user interaction your complex user interface component is supposed to allow and test for that interaction. Now, you can write your own custom tests, not with these tools, but with others. So if you were using something like Bhot to do automated testing of your application, you could certainly write tests to confirm that menus were accessible. Now, the reality is at the point in time that you're doing that, you've almost certainly ensured your menus were accessible, so it's less about diagnostics at that point and more about regression.
Great. Okay, now I'm going to show you an example of how to use the command line tools. And the one that we've chosen to demo is Lighthouse. And we thought that we would choose it because practically speaking, we think that for local testing, it's probably you're probably more likely to use it because A, it's free, and B, you can use it offline. To use the Lighthouse command line tool, you install a node extension, and then to run it, you just do Lighthouse and then the URL. So I'm just going to show you what it looks like to run it without any sort of modification. Let me see. So, okay, and I've just shown you. Let me sorry. Okay. So I've created, as a developer, I've created this beautiful form to demonstrate the command line tools. And so I'm just going to show you what it looks like. So I'm just going to do Lighthouse and then my local URL, and to show you what happens when you just use Lighthouse without any modification. You can see that it actually opens up the URL in a browser in Chrome, and it spits out all of this information about what it tested. It doesn't actually spit out any errors here by default. It tells you that you can view the report if you want to, that it has generated a report. So the way that I found it helpful to use it is that I used gulp to run the command here. So I did Lighthouse, and then I just added a couple of extra parameters. I said output as JSON. Now if you output as JSON, you just get a big blob of JSON. I'm just going to show you that so that you can see it. So what you can do, and what I did is I let it save the report. Here's the big blob of JSON. I let it save the report, and then I parsed it with just as a gulp task. So, and what that allows me to do, you can sort of use these tools any way that you want to, but what I decided would be helpful was that I run the gulp command with a pre-commit hook, so that when I'm altering my form, when I commit it, if there are any errors, it's going to show them to me. So, for example, if I go back to my form here, if my designer said, I like your form, but I would like it more if you took out the label and added placeholder attributes instead. So I'm going to say, okay, of course I will do that for you. And so I'm going to do git status. Wait a minute, sorry. Okay, that's my, okay. So here, this is my little module here with my form. Git commit. Changing title text to placeholder text. And it's going to, I'm using a tool called getguppy that allows me to call the gulp command from the pre-commit hook. Opens it up. Oh, wait a minute, sorry. Need to clear the cache. There we go. Okay, and it's going to show me, oh, look, I'm not going to commit this for you because there's an accessibility issue. And so here I've just, I'll just show you my gulp. Now basically I've just taken, in the JSON report, there's report categories, and I've just determined that the 2 is the category that corresponds to accessibility auditing. You'll recall that it has 5 different categories. So I'm just saying, take the accessibility category, and if there are items in result details, then I know that there are errors. So, so it just checks for that, and if there are any, it's going to spit out the name, help text, description. Now again, you can parse the JSON any way you like, but this is just an example of what you can do. And then, I can say, oh my goodness, well, that has caused an accessibility issue. So I'm going to put the title back in. And then once I do that, the error will be gone, and it will let me commit again.
So certainly one of the advantages of Lighthouse over the other tools, the first is that it's free, and the second is that you can easily use it offline. With Tenon and with Wave, the tests are, even when running from the command line, the tests are executed against an API in the cloud. And so it's a little bit more restrictive about how the tests can be run.
That's right. So now we're going to talk to, so that basically demonstrates that command line interfaces alert you to the issues instantly. They don't forget to test when you're in a rush. You don't have to remember, because it will remember for you to do the testing. It'll help you catch the issues before they go live. The cons are not all are free. Only Lighthouse is free. You can do this with both Tenon and Wave, but in order to, basically you can't do it offline. So you have to use another tool called ngrok, which is something that Carl from Tenon told me about, which just allows you to create a tunnel between your local instance and the internet, so that you can point to your local instance, and Tenon or Wave can analyze it for you. There is some configuration required, as we've seen. And another con is that it can only test a single URL at a time, and that must be set manually.
So one of the things that we recommend, obviously, if you're working on an application with thousands of pages of content, you don't, from the command line, want to test all 1,000 pages at the same time. And honestly, the change that you've made locally might not touch all 1,000 pages. It probably doesn't. We also considered maybe some sort of magic that you put in the affected URL in your git commit message, and the tool pulls it out and looks at only that URL. That seemed quite fragile, and once again, we're relying on developers who are, I'm certain, best intentioned, but when push comes to shove and the last couple of days of the sprint come, sometimes testing slips the mind of even the best intentioned developers. What we would recommend is that typically, if you take a look at one of your applications, you can break it down, whether it's 5 or 10 or 20 really clear key archetypal user interfaces. What we would recommend is that you put together that list of 5 or 10 or 20 example URLs, maybe the same URLs that you'd be using in your BHOT tests when you're testing the functionality of the application, and that you execute the tools against those. Now, from a command line interface standpoint, having that done on a git commit maybe causes too much testing to happen. And so what we'll show you next is an approach to moving this integration from the command line. Maybe you still ask your developers to manually execute the test on the command line against pages they know they've changed, but maybe we do the broader level of a smoke test against that top 20 URLs or key archetypes of the application during the integration process on a build server.
Yeah, and so one way that you can do that is to use Travis. So we set up, basically within Travis, set it up to do essentially the same thing that I showed you with the command line. And it's only testing one URL, but you can see that in the build, you can get it to test a URL, and if there are errors, you can have it exit, and it will email you to let you know. you can optionally have it fail the Travis build so that it won't push to dev. And optionally, you could also potentially integrate it. If you only wanted to test when you're pushing to production, you could use an Acquia hook to only have it triggered when you're about to push to production.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of layers and levels of testing here, and again, it's going to depend on you and your team and the tools you're using, what makes the most sense. Are you on a team where accessibility is a mandate and where it makes sense for you to test every time you push code to dev? And if that's the case, you probably want to identify those 5, 10, or 20 key archetypal pages of the application and test and have the Travis build fail if there's accessibility problems. What you might also want to do, and Laura mentioned Acquia Cloud Hooks, is you might also say, hey, our team pushes to production once every 2 weeks or once a month. We push changes to production. Maybe you want to run the tests again through an Acquia Cloud Hook on the push to production to confirm that things are working correctly on production. We mentioned earlier that Tenon has a crawler capability. Now, obviously, depending on the size of your application, the number of URLs there are to test, and the fact that Tenon API calls certainly have a cost to them, you might want to do this on a less periodic basis. But you could certainly, whether it's once every couple of weeks or once a quarter, have the Tenon API execute a crawl against your production website. One of the challenges that you'll have if you only test those 10 or 20 archetypal pages is you're likely going to catch 95, 98% of problems that are introduced through software development. What you're not going to be able to catch if you're only testing a sample of the pages are the types of barriers that are introduced through content. So using a tool, and this is where when we were talking about automated versus manual accessibility, we said really there's 2 types of tools, one that helps developers more so and one that helps conformance more so. Tenon has that nice feature where it's able to do the crawling and generate a report, and it kind of splits the fence between a tool that's built for developers, but also has capabilities that help with conformance.
Yeah, and Wave is going to have spidering ability this year, according to them. They're partnering with another company that will allow for the spidering. And Wave also has a standalone API that you can purchase. It allows you it can spider as well, and it can also test offline, which Tenon can't do. So with the Tenon, you would be triggering a spider that would occur once the code got to production. But with Wave API, you could actually potentially trigger it before it actually went live.
So you might be sitting there thinking, okay, this is good. It seems like these automated tools can make my life easier. Maybe if I integrate them into my continuous integration pipeline, they can make the accessibility of my application more reliable. But as we've been talking, we talked about the menu on the Nashville website. We talked about all of the things that these tools can't test for. And honestly, that may feel a bit disappointing. I've been doing this for nearly a decade now, and I'd have to say that I'm actually feeling quite optimistic about what the future might hold for these types of tools. I mean, machine learning, artificial intelligence, those are buzz terms. You stick them in an article, and all of a sudden, all sorts of people have read your article, or they've at least clicked the link. I do think that there's a number of things that machine learning applied to the domain of web accessibility testing will be able to do in the coming years to expand the reach not only of what we can identify through an automated tool, but also what we can remediate through an automated tool. So one of the first things that machine learning can help us do is identify and provide alternative mediums for images, sounds, and videos. That's already happening today. If you go onto YouTube, you upload a video onto YouTube, and there's already going to be auto captioning. Now, are those auto captions perfect? Absolutely, they are not. but they're a whole lot closer to perfect than the no captioning that was previously on the vast majority of videos on YouTube. Another item that these tools will become better at doing, and I think this is going to take more time, is identifying and conveying accurate meaning from those types of media. I've given an example here. Two adults standing with a dog in a nature landscape. So that might be something that if you were to look on Facebook does a decent job at this. If you look on Facebook, you look at an image somebody's uploaded, you'll see that they've added some auto-generated description to the images. Now, true, there might be two adults, a dog, and they might be standing in a nature landscape. And by the way, that on its own is far better than nothing. But what it doesn't really do is tell me, is this a picture of two people getting engaged? Is this a picture of two people having an argument? The tools aren't today as sophisticated as being able to pull out some of that meaning. Another thing, and this really comes back to that example we were talking about, the menu on the DrupalCon Nashville website, is being able to identify and resolve barriers through user interfaces. So if you can see the DrupalCon Nashville website, and you've been on the web for not even that long, you've probably got a pretty strong hunch that if you tap on or hover over those top-level menu items, something's going to drop down. There's something called a visual affordance being used that helps you to understand how the application behaves and therefore how you ought to be able to interact with the application. This is absolutely a domain where machine learning applied correctly will be able to build up an algorithm that would be able to analyze how web applications appear, understand the visual affordances, and therefore identify where there may be barriers. If we had a machine learning tool that was able to identify menus on a website, then automate the testing of those menus to ensure that they were accessible to persons with disabilities, we'd be much further ahead. Tools like Wave and Lighthouse and Tenon would be able to, in that browser extension, show you that there's a drop-down menu on this page, but that the submenu items are not navigable by keyboard. Taking it one step further, those tools in the future might be able to either recommend the resolution to the problem, or perhaps even using a client-side include, they may be able to automatically remediate the problem. And that might sound like wishful thinking, but if you ask around, you'll find out that I am not typically categorized as an optimist. That was a bit too much of a laugh. But this is really the future that's possible using some of these new tools and techniques. The last item, simplifying content and interfaces. And there has been some work done here, I believe, in the natural language processing communities, and I'm sure there's more work that needs to be done. But being able to take all of that rich content and information that your authoring teams are creating, taking all of those form fields and descriptions, if nothing else, being able to automatically assess the level of the language and the complexity of the language, but also being able to recommend synthesized, summarized, or simplified wording to ensure that the meaning that you're trying to convey is easily understood by the broadest set of users. So these are all things that I believe in the next 3 to 5 years, we will see tools like Lighthouse, Tenon, Wave, and others introduced to be able to identify and automatically remediate a broader set of accessibility barriers. We have about 5 minutes left. Are there any questions?
Yeah, do you want to come up to the mic?
Hey, yeah, so first of all, this talk was really, really useful. Thank you. So what about the submenus? Are you guys aware of a way of doing drop-down submenus so that they are accessible, or would a better answer be just find another way of doing the UI?
Yeah, it's a great question about the submenus in particular. One example that I point to quite often is mass.gov. They've done a lot of research and they've put a lot of time into the accessibility of the site, and I think they've done a good job with the drop-down menus.
So you've talked a little bit, sorry, one more.
Sure.
You talked about the testing tools and some of the AI and machine learning on that. So are there things coming or people are working on about kind of bypassing those barriers from a user perspective instead of when there's already problems on the website using that AI machine learning to kind of make that information more accessible from a client side?
I want to make sure I understand the question. Can you try rephrasing?
Yeah. So I guess like we got screen readers, we've got those sorts of things. Are those improving to the point to where accessibility becomes easier from a developer standpoint?
That's a good question. It's not something that I have read about or heard about happening, but it's certainly something worth considering more. So I think your question is, how is machine learning and AI being applied to the assistive technology itself to create more assistive or intuitive interfaces for persons with disabilities?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good question. It's not something I've given a great deal of thought to.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I actually have 3 questions. The first one is, have you used or tested Pally? Do you want me to list all 3 or go one by one?
Let's go one by one. This one's for you.
Have you guys used the Pally tool or tested that, or
Pally?
PA11Y?
Oh, no, I have not. I didn't test that. Yeah. Have you?
Yeah, we're currently using it, both a client-facing dashboard version of it, because it is free and open source, and then have built an internal Pally CI that we can test with it. So I didn't know how it stacked up against these ones.
Oh, cool.
All right, I'll answer that one. The second one is, do you have any opinions about accessibility overlay tools? Because I know there are a lot of solutions for, I see a smile up there. But we kind of have our own opinion, just getting yours.
So I did smile, and it's an interesting question. Notwithstanding recent events that may have happened with some of the vendors of those tools and defects, it really is. I'm going to play a fence sitting here, which is, on the one hand, I think that sometimes those tools may be misrepresented as to the level of benefit that they can have. On the other hand, I think that they provide so what you shouldn't do, at least in the next 2 to 3 years before some of these machine learning techniques become more mainstream, you shouldn't believe a vendor who says that if you install this JavaScript on your website, it will become accessible.
Okay.
However, some of those tools that you would install onto your website with some JavaScript do provide some, minimal, let's say, assistive technology to users who might not otherwise have access to the assistive technology. They provide opportunities to perhaps read some of the text aloud, perhaps to zoom or change contrast. They provide some tools, that persons who don't have access to the latest and greatest and therefore expensive technologies have. So there certainly is something to be said, and there's merit for trying to get that type of technology and information access into as many hands as possible. I think really what it comes down to is, are you being told that the tool solves all of your problems? Then you're being told something that's wrong. If you're being told that the tool, coupled alongside training for your development, design, and testing teams, a commitment by the teams to always test and build accessibly, a commitment by your organization to monitor its broader conformance to accessibility and to set targets for improving. If you do all of those things together in a program and also add these types of overlay tools onto your application, that's what's going to get you broader reach and better accessibility for all.
Okay, thank you for that confirmation. Not to make myself a black sheep, but I'm in sales and account management, so I get a lot of calls saying, why would I go with remediation or Drupal when I can buy this thing that makes my site, and they are being told 100% accessible.
Absolutely.
So
Yep.
it's been a challenge, so thank you. And then final quick question is, what do you mean by automatically remediate code?
So I believe that in the future, the story that we've been sometimes told by some of those overlay organizations might become true. I don't think we're going to get to a place anytime soon where there's this magic one line of JavaScript that solves all of the accessibility barriers in an application. But I do think that we'll get to a place in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years where some of the most common patterns, let's say the drop-down menu as an example, will be able to be identified and automatically resolved through a tool, where the tool might be able to inject JavaScript into the application that is able to solve that accessibility barrier without having a developer go rewrite the code for the application. And I'd say that that's always going to be the second best option. The best option is always going to be that the application be designed and developed and tested to be fully accessible. But I do think that for some of the more common user interface components, drop-down menus, calendars, etc., that we'll probably see tools start to emerge that can both identify and remediate those problems without developer intervention.
Great, thank you so much.
Hi, it was a great talk, thank you. I'm just curious, there's a lot of discussion around the development perspective on accessibility testing. And I was curious if you're, basically depending on the way a site is built, the content authors have to think about it as well. So I was wondering if you are aware of any efforts underway to address that from like a publishing or workflow standpoint, basically using any of these tools in that way in Drupal.
Certainly, and I wouldn't think that it's these tools in particular being used for that, but I do know that the community, more broadly speaking, and I think that there may have been a core talk yesterday where this came up, and maybe check in with Mike Gifford, and you could follow up with him. Certainly looking at the administrative interface and the authoring experience is a very important thing. I mean, there's two, like everything else, there's two ends to this. One is proper training and tools for the authors. And the second one is taking one of those conformance tools and maybe doing a regular audit of the site to say, maybe once a month, once a quarter, let's identify where the barriers are. But I don't think we can ever avoid training. I mean, tools aside, whether it's development, testing, design, or content authoring, we really can't avoid the training aspect because for the foreseeable future, there are going to be many, many aspects of accessibility where the testing cannot be automated.
Great, thank you.
One more question?
Yeah.
Does anybody else want it? Okay, because I already asked one, I don't want to be selfish. So I ran the Wave tool against a site that we just launched, and it performed really well, which was great, except for the Google Translate widget. And like, the client had two really important requirements. One was that it be accessible, and the other that it have the Google Translate widget. So, I mean, I could ask you a very specific hyper-technical question about what do you do if there's an undefined anchor? But the better question would be, is there some sort of approach that you can recommend when you're bringing in third-party tools to make sure that they don't break the accessibility on your site?
Well, I mean, the short answer is no, you can't make sure they don't, but you can remediate them. And I mean, this feels hackish, but I've had to do it before. I remember years ago I was working with a calendar because they are, you know, the scourge of accessibility components. But I was working with a React calendar component, I don't know, 3 years ago. And I asked my team, okay, does this component have like a previous and next month button? Because I would think it should, but there doesn't seem to be one. And they're like, yeah, they're right there. And I'm like, no, they're not right there. And what I realized is, like, yes, this calendar component in React did have previous and next buttons, but they were so poorly accessible, not only didn't they work for me, I didn't even know they were there. And so yes, we chose to move ahead with using that component, but we kind of had to remediate the accessibility of the component. Now there's 2 ways to do that. The first one's really easy, which is you open an issue in the GitHub repository for that open source library, you put in a pull request that has the solution, and the very benevolent author of the component incorporates it and issues a new release. The second one, if you're working with something that's more closed source or maybe a library that's been a bit abandoned, I mean, outside of forking it and going your own direction, if there's really nothing else you can do, you need to write some JavaScript that loads after your component that remediates the component itself. A little bit more fragile of a solution, but a solution all the same. All right, well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming out.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
I just wanted to say thank you for the shout out to Nashville. I work with Nashville.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome.
It's always glad to be recognized. We're trying hard to do a good job. So.
No, it's a
Great.
good example. It's probably the best example that I've come across.
I am definitely you guys sound like
Excellent.
Thank you very much. It's great job.
Right. Well, I mean, the short answer is because we just had to limit the number of tools.
Is it something that you would?
Absolutely. Like, you know, would be interested in testing it. Yeah.
I wasn't sure if it's the kind of thing where it's kind of a dinosaur and kind of clunky and so people don't use it anymore, or if it actually is valuable.
Yeah.
Which one is this?
It's called.
University of Illinois Functional Accessibility Evaluator.
Yes. Well,
So
it is
I tend to go
older.
to that.
Sure, it is older, though I don't know that that's a bad thing or a good thing. It is an older tool, but so is Wave, for that matter.
Yeah.
The reality is we had to